The mafia boss noticed the waitress was terrified. What he found out changed everything. The porcelain coffee cup clattered against the saucer, a sharp, violent sound in the quiet diner. The dark liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the pristine white tablecloth and splashing onto the cuff of a $4,000 tailored suit. Caleb didn't flinch. He slowly lifted his dark, heavy gaze from the table to the woman standing above him. I'm so sorry," Claire whispered, her voice cracking, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold the carafe. Caleb was a man who commanded fear. He breathed it, weaponized it, lived by it. He knew what people looked like when they were terrified of him. But as he stared into Claire's wide, bloodshot eyes, a chilling realization settled over him. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking past him, at the door. She wasn't terrified of the monster sitting at the table. She was terrified of whatever was coming next. The neon sign of the Silver Star Diner buzzed with a relentless, erratic hum, casting long, sickly yellow shadows across the checkerboard linoleum floor. It was 3 a.m, the hour when the city's pulse slowed to a crawl, and only the lost, the broken, or the dangerous were awake. Caleb sat in the corner booth, his back to the wall, his eyes scanning the perimeter with the instinctual paranoia of a man who had survived a decade at the absolute pinnacle of the city's underworld. He was exhausted. A turf war on the south side had kept him awake for 48 hours, dealing in the currency of whispered threats and calculated violence. He had come here for the anonymity, for the bitter, burnt coffee, and for a moment of silence. But the silence was shattered the moment Claire approached his table. From the second she had walked out from behind the swinging aluminum doors of the kitchen, Caleb had noticed her. In his line of work, observing the minutiae of human behavior was not just a skill, it was the mechanism that kept him breathing. Claire was young, perhaps mid-20s, clad in a faded pink uniform that hung loosely on her fragile frame. Her hair, a messy tangle of dull blonde, was pulled back into a haphazard ponytail, strands escaping to cling to the sweat on her forehead. But it was her movements that caught his eye. They were jerky, hyper-vigilant. She walked like a deer caught in an open field, expecting a rifle crack at any second. When she finally reached his booth to refill his cup, the disaster happened. The coffee splashed across his cuff. The average man might have shouted. A lesser boss might have backhanded her just for the disrespect. Caleb did neither. He remained completely motionless, his imposing frame perfectly still beneath his charcoal suit. I'm so sorry," Claire stammered, the carafe rattling against the table edge as she desperately tried to set it down. She scrambled for a handful of cheap paper napkins from the dispenser, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Please, sir, I'll pay for the cleaning. I swear I'll take it out of my tips. I didn't mean to." Caleb watched her hands. They were raw, the knuckles red, but it was the tremor that fascinated him. It wasn't the slight shake of exhaustion or the nervous flutter of serving a wealthy customer. It was a deep, neurological quake. It was the physical manifestation of pure, unadulterated dread. He looked up at her face. Her pale skin was drawn tight over her cheekbones. Dark, bruising bags hung heavily under her eyes, which were wide and darting frantically toward the front glass windows of the diner. "Stop!" Caleb said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that didn't need volume to carry weight. It was the voice of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Claire froze, the crumpled napkins clutched in her fist. A tear slipped down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail through the faint dusting of flour on her face. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if bracing for a physical blow. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Slowly, Claire opened her eyes and met his gaze. Caleb's eyes were a piercing, cold slate grey, eyes that had watched empires crumble and men beg for their lives, but right now they were merely analytical. "It's just a shirt," Caleb said, his tone devoid of anger. He reached out and gently took the wet napkins from her trembling grip. "You're going to tear it." "I'm sorry," she whispered again, stepping back, wrapping her arms around her thin torso as if trying to hold herself together. "You've said that," Caleb replied, leaning back against the red vinyl upholstery. "What you haven't said is why you're looking at the front door every 5 seconds, like the devil himself is about to walk through it." Claire swallowed hard, her throat working visibly. "It's nothing. I'm just tired. I've worked a double shift." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Caleb had interrogated hardened criminals, politicians, and assassins. He could spot a lie in the twitch of an eyelid. He let the silence stretch, allowing the heavy atmosphere of the diner to press in on them. The rain began to lash against the plate glass windows, blurring the streetlights into streaks of neon color. "Go back to the counter," Caleb finally said, his gaze shifting away from her to stare out into the storm. "Bring me another cup, and stop looking at the door. If something is coming for you, staring at the glass won't stop it from shattering." Claire gave a quick, jerky nod and practically fled back to the safety of the counter. Caleb remained in his booth, the cold dampness of the spilled coffee seeping through his sleeve. He should have left. He had an empire to run, lieutenants to manage, enemies to crush. He didn't have time for the mundane tragedies of a late-night waitress. Yet a strange, unfamiliar anchor held him to the red vinyl seat. He was a predator, the apex of the city's concrete jungle. And right now, every instinct he possessed was telling him that another predator was circling in the dark outside, and the prey was currently wiping down the pie display with shaking hands. Caleb decided to wait. He wanted to see what kind of monster made a woman tremble like that. The diner settled back into its uneasy, fluorescent-lit purgatory. For the next 30 minutes, Caleb simply existed in the corner booth, a silent, brooding monolith. He drank the fresh, scalding coffee Claire had brought him, this time without spilling a drop, though she had practically shoved the mug onto the table before retreating. He watched her work. She was methodical but frantic, scrubbing the same spot on the laminate counter over and over until her knuckles were stark white. Every time the headlights of a passing car swept across the front window, her entire body flinched, her shoulders jumping toward her ears. Caleb's mind, usually a fortress of strategic planning and ruthless calculations, was entirely occupied by the fragile woman 20 feet away. In his world, fear was a tool, a currency used to buy loyalty or ensure silence. But the fear radiating from Claire was different. It was the desperate, suffocating fear of the powerless. It reminded him of a time long before the tailored suits and the armored cars, a time when he was just a kid in a crumbling tenement, listening to the heavy boots of debt collectors on the stairs. He hated that memory. And by extension, he was beginning to hate whoever was causing Claire to look so much like his younger self. At exactly 3:45 a.m., the bell above the glass door chimed. The sound was bright and cheerful, a grotesque contrast to the sudden, icy drop in the room's temperature. Caleb didn't turn his head, but his eyes tracked sideways, catching the reflection in the chrome trim of the jukebox. A man walked in. He was tall, thick around the middle, wearing a cheap leather jacket that smelled faintly of stale smoke and damp pavement even from a distance. He moved with a lazy, entitled swagger, the walk of a man who enjoyed inflicting pain and rarely faced consequences for it. Two other men, smaller but equally jagged around the edges, lingered outside on the rain-slicked sidewalk, leaning against the brick wall beneath the awning. Claire was standing by the cash register. The moment the door chimed, Caleb saw her spine lock rigid. The damp rag slipped from her fingers, landing on the floor with a wet smack. She didn't move to pick it up. The man in the leather jacket didn't sit down. He walked straight to the counter, invading Claire's space, leaning over the laminate top until his face was inches from hers. Caleb shifted his weight, his right hand slipping instinctively beneath his tailored jacket, resting on the cold steel of the suppressed pistol holstered at his hip. He didn't draw it. He just rested his hand there, a silent promise to himself. "Evening, Claire," the man said. His voice was a greasy, grating sneer that carried across the quiet diner. "I told you," Claire said, her voice a reedy whisper, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerators. "I don't get paid until Friday. You said I had until Friday." "Things change, sweetheart," the man replied, reaching out. Caleb saw Claire try to pull back, but the man's hand shot forward, his thick fingers wrapping painfully around her fragile wrist. He yanked her forward, causing her to stumble against the counter. "The boss is feeling impatient. He wants the interest tonight. $2,000, or else the arrangement changes." "I don't have it!" Claire gasped, tears welling up, her free hand frantically trying to pry his fingers off her wrist. "Please, Marcus, you know I don't have that kind of cash. I gave you everything I had last week. Just give me 3 more days, please." Marcus tightened his grip. Caleb could see the white pressure of his fingers against Claire's pale skin. 3 days is a long time, Claire. Anything could happen in 3 days. Be a real shame if something happened to that little sister of yours on her way home from middle school. City's a dangerous place, you know. A soft, choked sob escaped Claire's lips. The sound cut through the diner like a physical blade. Caleb felt a cold, familiar darkness rising in his chest. It was the absolute, icy calm that always preceded extreme violence. He was the most dangerous man in this city, a kingmaker and an executioner. He dealt in millions, controlled docks, unions, and entire city blocks. Yet here was a street-level parasite, a bottom feeder, terrorizing a waitress over pocket change and threatening a child. "I'll get it," Claire wept, her resistance breaking completely. "I'll find a way. Just don't touch her. Please, God, don't go near her." "You have until your shift ends tonight," Marcus said, leaning in closer, his breath practically on her cheek. "I'll be waiting out back. Have the envelope, or I make a phone call, and your sister doesn't make it to homeroom tomorrow." He released her wrist with a violent shove that sent her crashing back into the pie display case. The glass rattled ominously. Marcus smirked, zipped up his leather jacket, and turned toward the door. As he walked out, his eyes briefly swept the diner and landed on Caleb sitting in the dim corner booth. Marcus scoffed, dismissing the quiet man in the suit as just another late-night loser, and pushed through the door out into the rain. Claire slid down the front of the display case, pulling her knees to her chest, hiding her face in her arms as she shook with silent, desperate sobs. Caleb slowly removed his hand from his weapon. The tension in his jaw could have shattered glass. He looked at the half-empty cup of black coffee on the table. He took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark, calculated part of his brain, the part that had built his empire, was already mapping out the logistics. He didn't know this woman. He owed her nothing. But the rules of his world were absolute. The strong preyed on the weak. That was the law of the street. But Caleb was the boss, and tonight, he decided, he was going to rewrite the law. The rain had intensified from a steady drizzle to a torrential downpour by the time Claire's shift ended at 4 in the morning. The city was a sprawling canvas of wet asphalt and blurred, bleeding lights. Inside the diner, Claire had moved through her final chores like a ghost. She was pale, her movements mechanical, her eyes completely devoid of the frantic energy from earlier. Now there was only a hollow, crushing defeat. She untied her apron, her hands moving numbly, the red welts from Marcus's grip standing out starkly against her pale wrist. Caleb had left 10 minutes before her, slipping out the front door silently, leaving a crisp $100 bill beneath his coffee cup. Claire hadn't even noticed him leave. Her mind was entirely consumed by the countdown ticking in her head. $2,000. She might as well have been asked to produce the moon. She had nothing. Her bank account was overdrawn. Her credit cards were maxed out from her mother's funeral expenses. There was no one left to call. She pushed open the heavy back door of the diner. The alleyway was a canyon of brick and rusted fire escapes, smelling of wet garbage and diesel fumes. The only light came from a single, flickering bulb above the exit. As the heavy steel door clicked shut behind her, plunging her into the gloom, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Right on time," a voice rasped from the shadows. Claire stopped dead. The rain plastered her thin coat to her skin instantly. From the darkness near the dumpsters, 3 figures detached themselves. Marcus stepped into the dim pool of light, his leather jacket slick with rain. His 2 associates flanked him, their faces hidden beneath the brims of cheap baseball caps, their hands shoved deep into their pockets. "Got the envelope, sweetheart?" Marcus asked, holding out a thick, calloused hand. Claire took a step backward, her back pressing flat against the cold, wet brick of the diner. I couldn't get it," she whispered, the rain masking the tears streaming down her face. "I tried. I swear I tried. Nobody is awake. Nobody has that kind of cash. Please, Marcus, tomorrow morning, I'll pawn my car. I'll do anything." Marcus's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl of ugly, unadulterated malice. He spat onto the wet pavement. "I told you what happens when you waste my time, Claire." He gestured to the man on his left. "Call the boys. Tell them to pay the little sister a visit." "No!" Claire screamed, lunging forward, pure adrenaline overriding her terror. She grabbed Marcus's jacket. "No, please, take me! Do whatever you want to me, just leave her alone!" Marcus backhanded her. The blow was casual but brutal, sending Claire sprawling to the wet asphalt. She tasted copper in her mouth, her head ringing as the cold puddle soaked through her clothes. She looked up, dizzy, watching Marcus step toward her, drawing back his foot. Suddenly the roar of a massive engine shattered the alley's echoing silence. Twin beams of blinding halogen light swept into the narrow brick corridor, illuminating the driving rain like thousands of falling needles. A sleek, midnight black town car, heavy and armored, glided into the alley with terrifying speed, stopping just inches from Marcus. The tires hissed aggressively against the wet pavement. Marcus stumbled back, throwing his hands up to shield his eyes from the blinding high beams. "Hey, watch where you're driving, you rich—" The heavy thud of the car doors opening cut him off. It wasn't just the driver. From the shadows at the mouth of the alley, 2 massive figures stepped forward, moving with silent military precision, cutting off the only exit. But it was the man who stepped out of the back of the town car who sucked the oxygen entirely out of the damp air. Caleb stepped into the rain. He wore a long, dark overcoat over his tailored suit, holding a black umbrella that shielded him from the downpour. He moved with a slow, terrifying grace, stepping around the front of the car until he stood between the thugs and Claire, who was still huddled on the ground, staring up in absolute shock. Caleb didn't yell. He didn't posture. He simply stood there, an immovable mountain of dark authority. The ambient light from the car illuminated the sharp angles of his face and the cold, dead calm in his grey eyes. "You're making a lot of noise in my city," Caleb said softly. His voice barely rose above the sound of the rain, yet it carried with devastating clarity. Marcus blinked against the glare, trying to regain his false bravado. He puffed out his chest. "Yeah? And who the hell are you, pal? This ain't your business. Take your fancy car and walk, before me and me boys here." Marcus's voice died in his throat. His eyes had finally adjusted enough to see past the glare. He looked at Caleb's face, then down to Caleb's right hand, resting casually on the silver handle of his umbrella. And then he saw the ring, a heavy, custom-forged platinum ring depicting a snarling wolf, the undeniable crest of the most ruthless syndicate on the eastern seaboard. All the color drained from Marcus's face. His jaw went slack. The two men behind him took a synchronized step backward, their aggressive posture instantly crumbling into absolute panic. "I am the business," Caleb said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of a death sentence. "And I don't like the noise." Marcus swallowed audibly, his hands rising defensively, palms out. The arrogant predator from the diner was gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered rat. Mr. Thorne, we didn't know. We were just collecting a debt. That's all. Small-time stuff." Caleb didn't look at him. Without turning his head, he spoke to the men blocking the alley entrance. "Take their weapons, break their legs, leave them in the dumpsters. If I see them in my city again, don't leave them breathing." The order was delivered with the casual indifference of a man ordering lunch. Marcus screamed, scrambling backward, but Caleb's men were already moving. They descended on the thugs with brutal, silent efficiency. There were muffled shouts, the sickening sound of snapping bone, and then the heavy thuds of bodies hitting the garbage bins. Caleb ignored it all. He turned his back on the violence, crouched down on the wet asphalt, ruining the knees of his bespoke trousers, and extended a large, calloused hand to the trembling, soaking wet waitress. "Come with me," Caleb said gently, his eyes holding hers. Claire didn't know how to process what was happening. Her brain, overloaded by fear, adrenaline, and the sudden, explosive violence, simply shut down. She stared at the large hand extended toward her, the platinum wolf ring glinting in the headlights. Then she looked up at the man's face. He had just ordered 3 men crippled with the casual ease of swiping away a fly, yet the eyes looking down at her were patient, almost soft. Operating on pure instinct, she placed her cold, trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and overwhelmingly secure. Caleb pulled her to her feet effortlessly, his other hand holding the umbrella over her, shielding her from the driving rain, while he let his own coat get soaked. He led her to the open door of the town car. The interior smelled of expensive leather and faint cedar. "Get in," he instructed quietly. Claire slid into the back seat, her wet clothes instantly staining the pristine cream upholstery. Caleb climbed in beside her, snapping the umbrella shut. The heavy door closed with a solid, airtight thud, instantly plunging them into near-absolute silence, cutting off the roar of the storm and the moans from the alley. "Drive! The safe house!" Caleb commanded the driver. The partition was up, the driver nodded silently in the rearview mirror, and the massive car glided smoothly onto the slick streets. Claire sat rigid against the door, hugging her knees to her chest, shivering violently from the cold and the shock. She turned her head slowly, staring at Caleb. In the dim, ambient light of the street lamps passing by, he looked carved from granite. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely working. "What? What did you just do?" Caleb reached into a compartment between the seats, pulling out a thick, heated blanket. He draped it over her shoulders without asking, his movements deliberate and unhurried. My name is Caleb. As for what I did, I took out the trash. Drink this. He poured a cup of hot water from a silver thermos and handed it to her. Claire took it, her hands shaking so badly the water rippled. You're him, she breathed, the realization suddenly dawning on her. She had lived in this city all her life. She knew the ghost stories, the whispered names of the men who truly ran the streets, the politicians, the police. You're Caleb Thorne. I am, Caleb replied evenly. He didn't offer apologies or justifications. He watched her closely, waiting for the terror to set back in. He expected her to shrink away, to scream, to be let out. Instead, Claire let out a long, shuddering breath, her head dropping back against the leather headrest. A strange, hysterical laugh bubbled up from her throat. Of course my debt collector gets beaten up by the head of the mafia. Why wouldn't that happen today? It's Tuesday. Caleb's lips twitched, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Shock makes people say strange things, Claire. Drink the water. She took a sip, the heat scalding her throat but grounding her in reality. How do you know my name? I read your name tag at the diner. Caleb shifted, turning his body fully toward her. The air in the car was heavy with his presence. Now I need you to tell me exactly what kind of mess you are in. From the beginning. Do not omit anything. Do not lie to me. The command was absolute. Claire looked into those steely grey eyes and knew that lying to this man was a death sentence far worse than anything Marcus could inflict. And suddenly, the dam broke. The secret she had been carrying, the crushing weight that had been slowly destroying her, poured out. It's my father, Claire began, her voice trembling. He was an addict, gambling. He passed away 6 months ago from a heart attack. I thought that was the end of it. But he didn't owe a bank. He owed the Tarasov syndicate $80,000. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly at the name. The Tarasovs were a brutal, chaotic Russian outfit operating on the fringes of the city. They were reckless, favoring violence over business, and Caleb despised them. They came to me after the funeral, Claire continued, tears spilling over her lashes, soaking into the heated blanket. They said the debt transferred to me. I work 2 jobs. I sell blood plasma. I gave them everything I could, but the interest is designed so I can never pay it off. Last week I missed a payment. That's when Marcus started showing up. Her voice cracked, a sob tearing through her chest. They took pictures of my little sister, Lily. She's 12. They showed me pictures of her walking home from school. They said if I didn't have 2,000 tonight, they would take her. The silence in the car was absolute, save for the hum of the engine and the muffled drumming of the rain. Claire buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, the shame and the terror finally breaking her completely. Caleb sat perfectly still. To the untrained eye, he looked indifferent. But inside, a cold, calculated fury was crystallizing. The Tarasovs had crossed a line, threatening children, extorting waitresses. It was sloppy, it was dishonorable, and it was happening in his territory. He reached out, his large hand gently but firmly gripping her shoulder. He didn't pat her, he anchored her. "Claire," he said. His voice was an iron rod, hard and unyielding. She looked up, wiping her eyes. "The debt is gone." "You don't understand," she wept. "They are monsters. They have an army." "No," Caleb corrected her softly, his eyes flashing with a terrifying, absolute certainty. "I have an army. They are just dead men who haven't stopped breathing yet. You and your sister are under my protection now. No one will ever touch you again." The town car glided through the iron gates of a sprawling, heavily fortified estate nestled in the hills overlooking the city. Claire was led inside a mansion that felt more like a fortress, quiet, cavernous, and immaculate. Caleb handed her over to a kind-faced older woman named Maria, his housekeeper, with strict instructions to get Claire dry clothes, hot food, and a secure bedroom. He also dispatched a four-man tactical team to Claire's apartment to collect her little sister, Lily, and bring her safely to the compound. Once he was certain Claire was secure, Caleb retreated to his study. The room was dark, panelled in rich mahogany, smelling of fine scotch and old paper. He didn't turn on the main lights, preferring the illumination of his massive, multi-screen command desk. Caleb loosened his tie, threw his ruined suit jacket over a chair, and poured himself 2 fingers of amber liquid. He didn't drink it. He just stared at the glass, letting the anger settle into a cold, lethal focus. He picked up his secure phone. "Silas," Caleb said when the line connected. Silas was his second in command, a man composed entirely of sharp edges and absolute loyalty. "Wake up the captains. We are going to war." There was a brief pause on the line. "Who is the target, boss?" "The Tarasov Syndicate," Caleb replied smoothly. "They've been bleeding into the South Wards. I've tolerated their messiness long enough. Tonight, they threatened a child to extort a waitress to cover a dead man's gambling debt. It's bad for business. It's bad for the city." "Understood," Silas said, his voice instantly dropping into operational mode. "What's the play, surgical or loud?" "Surgical," Caleb instructed. "I want their ledgers. I want their armories. And I want the men who run the debt collection operations rounded up. But do not touch Viktor Tarasov. He belongs to me." For the next 4 hours, Caleb orchestrated a masterpiece of synchronized destruction. Sitting in his quiet, luxurious office, he moved his pieces across the city's chessboard. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten, he simply issued calm, precise directives. By 8 a.m., while the city was just waking up and brewing its morning coffee, the Tarasov Syndicate was systematically dismantled. Warehouses burned, illegal casinos were raided by Caleb's paid police contacts, and dozens of Tarasov enforcers found themselves bound and gagged in the back of moving vans. It was a staggering display of power. Caleb wasn't just a criminal, he was an institution. And he was bringing the full, crushing weight of that institution down to protect a woman he had known for less than 6 hours. Why? He asked himself that question as dawn broke, casting long grey shadows across his study. He could have just paid the $80,000 out of pocket. It was pocket change to him. He could have handed Claire a briefcase and sent her away. But as he remembered the violent trembling of her hands, the sheer terror in her eyes, paying them off felt like a surrender. It validated the monsters. Caleb had built his empire on violence, yes, but there was a twisted morality to it. A code: you don't touch children, you don't crush the innocent. The Tarasovs were a cancer, and Claire was the symptom that finally forced him to excise it. A soft knock on the heavy oak door broke his reverie. Maria stepped in. "Mr. Thorne, the young woman is awake. Her sister has arrived as well. They are in the kitchen." Caleb nodded, downing the scotch in one smooth motion. "Thank you, Maria." He walked out of his study, adjusting his cuffs. As he approached the massive industrial kitchen, he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. Laughter. It was a weak, hesitant sound, but it was unmistakably Claire's. He stepped into the doorway. Claire was sitting at the marble island, wearing a soft, oversized grey sweater that belonged to him. Her hair was clean, falling in damp waves around her shoulders. Beside her sat Lily, a bright-eyed 12-year-old tearing into a stack of pancakes. Claire looked up and saw him. The smile faltered slightly, replaced by a look of deep, profound awe and lingering fear. "They brought her," Claire said softly, sliding off the stool. She walked toward him, stopping a few feet away. "Your men?" "They went to the neighbor's house where she was sleeping. They were polite. They brought her to me. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," Caleb said, his voice gentler than it had been all night. "Your sister is safe. The men who bothered you last night are no longer a concern." Claire searched his face, her eyes desperate for truth. "And the debt?" "Victor Tarasov, he won't stop. If you don't pay him, he'll come for us. He'll come for you." Caleb stepped closer, close enough to smell the vanilla soap she had used in the shower. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Victor Tarasov is going to wipe the debt clean himself, tonight." Claire's eyes widened. "How?" "Because," Caleb said, the cold mob boss edge returning to his voice, "we are going to pay him a visit, and you are going to tell him that your account is closed." The idea of willingly walking into the Tarasov stronghold terrified Claire so deeply she felt physically ill. She had spent the entire afternoon pacing the luxurious guest bedroom, clutching her stomach. Caleb had explained the plan. Victor Tarasov operated out of a heavily guarded nightclub in the industrial district. He expected Claire to come begging for more time or to offer up her sister. Caleb wanted her to walk in through the front door. "It's a suicide mission," she had whispered, staring out the reinforced glass window of the mansion. "It is a statement," Caleb had corrected her, standing behind her, his reflection superimposed over hers in the glass. "If I simply kill him, his lieutenants take over. They inherit his ledgers, they inherit you. If Victor publicly zeroes your balance in front of his men because I command it, you become untouchable. They will know that looking at you sideways is an act of war against my family." He had dressed her for the part. Gone was the faded diner uniform. Maria had provided a sleek, tailored black trench coat over a simple, elegant, dark dress. It was armor. When Claire looked in the mirror, she didn't see the terrified waitress. She looked like someone who belonged in Caleb's world, sharp, dark, and expensive. At 10 p.m., the black town car wound its way down from the hills and into the gritty heart of the industrial sector. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflective under the harsh glare of sodium vapor lamps. Claire sat rigidly in the back seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop the shaking. Caleb sat beside her, clad in a fresh black suit, a black silk shirt, and no tie. He radiated an aura of absolute, terrifying calm. He was checking the magazine of a heavy matte black handgun. The metallic snick-clack of the weapon was the only sound in the car. He slid the gun into his shoulder holster and finally looked at her. "Breathe, Claire," he commanded softly. "I can't," she confessed, her voice tight. "I'm going to ruin this. When I see him, I'm going to freeze." Caleb shifted closer. He reached out and took her hands, unfolding her clenched fingers. His thumbs traced the fading red bruises Marcus had left on her wrists. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, demanding her complete attention. "You are not the prey tonight. You are the bait, and I am the trap. When you walk through those doors, you will feel fear. Let it wash over you, then push it down. You walk straight. You keep your head up, because you are walking in with the king." His words, spoken with such quiet, absolute conviction, sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. It was a bizarre infusion of confidence. This monster, this lethal man of shadows, was pouring his strength into her. The car pulled up to the curb outside the Red Star, a brutalist concrete building thumping with muffled, heavy bass. A line of imposing men in cheap suits stood by the velvet rope. "Ready?" Caleb asked. Claire swallowed the lump in her throat. She thought of Lily sleeping safely in the mansion. She thought of the months of agonizing, suffocating terror. She nodded. "Ready?" The driver opened the door. Claire stepped out onto the damp pavement, the cool night air biting at her cheeks. Caleb stepped out behind her, instantly falling into step beside her. They didn't go to the back of the line. Caleb walked straight toward the massive bouncers at the front door. One of the bouncers, a giant with a scarred face, stepped forward holding up a hand. "Private event tonight, pal. Hit the—" The man stopped. He looked at Caleb's face. He looked at the wolf ring glinting under the neon sign. The blood drained from the bouncer's face so fast he looked like a corpse. He swallowed hard, immediately stepping aside and pulling the velvet rope back. He didn't say a word. Caleb didn't acknowledge him. He placed a hand lightly on the small of Claire's back, a gesture that was both possessive and intensely protective. "Walk," he murmured against her ear. Claire squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and stepped into the lion's den. The heavy, thumping bass vibrated through her chest, but as they moved through the crowded, dimly lit club, the music seemed to fade into white noise. The crowd instinctively parted for them. They didn't know who Claire was, but the predatory, lethal energy radiating from Caleb cleared a path like a snow plow. They bypassed the dance floor, moving straight toward the VIP staircase guarded by 4 men, armed with submachine guns hanging openly on tactical slings. The guards moved to block the stairs, raising their weapons. Caleb didn't break his stride. He simply looked at the lead guard. "Tell Victor that Caleb Thorne is coming upstairs. If you raise that weapon 1 more inch, I will feed it to you." The guard hesitated, his eyes darting to his earpiece. The name alone carried enough weight to cause a localized earthquake. After an agonizing second, the guard lowered his weapon and stepped aside. "Up we go," Caleb said softly to Claire, his hand never leaving her back. They climbed the stairs into the darkness. The VIP lounge was a sprawling, opulent room overlooking the dance floor through bulletproof glass. It smelled of expensive cigars, cheap perfume, and spilled vodka. At the far end, sitting on a red velvet couch flanked by 6 heavily armed men, was Viktor Tarasov. He was a brute of a man, wide and thick, with a shaved head and cruel, dark eyes. As Caleb and Claire stepped into the room, the music was abruptly cut. The silence was deafening. Every weapon in the room was subtly shifted, safety catches clicking off, pointing toward the entrance. Victor stared. He looked at Caleb, confusion flashing across his face, and then his eyes landed on Claire. A nasty, triumphant grin spread across his heavy features. "Well, well," Victor boomed, his voice echoing in the large room. "The little waitress. I heard my boys ran into some trouble picking up your collection tonight. And you bring a bodyguard?" Victor sneered at Caleb, clearly not recognizing him in the dim lighting, or perhaps too drunk on his own power to care. "You brought a suit to fight my men. You are stupider than your father, Claire." Claire's heart hammered furiously against her ribs, but the heat of Caleb's hand on her back anchored her. She remembered his words. "You are not the prey." "I'm not here to fight, Victor," Claire said. To her own shock, her voice didn't waver. It was clear and sharp. "I'm here to close my account." Victor laughed, a harsh, barking sound. His men chuckled with him. "Close your account? With what? Did you sell a kidney, little girl? The interest alone is $5,000 this week." Caleb stepped forward, moving smoothly in front of Claire, shielding her with his body. He reached into his coat pocket. Instantly, 6 guns were leveled at his head. Caleb didn't even blink. He pulled out a small black leather ledger and tossed it onto the glass coffee table in front of Victor. It landed with a heavy smack. Victor's laughter died. He looked at the ledger, then back at Caleb. "What is this?" "That is your Southern District accounting book," Caleb said, his voice dropping into a register that commanded absolute authority. It was the voice of a king passing judgment. "Taken from your warehouse on 4th Street 2 hours ago, right before I burned the building to the ground." Victor's eyes widened in horror. He snatched the ledger off the table, flipping through the pages. His face turned an ugly shade of purple. "Who the hell are you?" he roared, drawing a heavy revolver from his waistband. "My name is Caleb Thorne." The name hung in the air like a live grenade. The goons holding the rifles physically flinched. Caleb Thorne was a myth, a ghost who controlled the city's arteries. Victor's bravado shattered instantly, replaced by a desperate, panicked rage. "Thorne!" Victor spat, his hand shaking slightly as he kept the gun pointed at Caleb's chest. "This isn't your territory. This is a private matter. This girl owes me." "This girl," Caleb said, his tone icy and precise, "is under my protection. You threatened her. You threatened a child. You sent bottom feeders to harass her in my city." "She owes a debt," Victor yelled, desperate to maintain face in front of his men. 80,000. You want her? You pay her debt, Thorne, or we go to war." Caleb smiled. It was a terrifying, mirthless expression that made Claire shiver. "War?" Caleb mused softly. He took a slow step forward, the barrel of Victor's gun inches from his chest. "Victor, war requires two sides fighting. What happened to your organization tonight wasn't a war. It was pest control. Call your harbor master. Call your casino managers. Call them right now." Victor stared, paralyzed. "They won't answer," Caleb whispered, leaning in, "because my men are currently holding their phones. I have seized your shipments. I have locked down your accounts. I own you, Victor. I can erase you from this city with a single phone call, or I can walk out of here and let you keep this pathetic club. But the price of your survival is the ledger." Caleb pointed to a specific page in the book, still gripped in Victor's trembling hand. "Zero the balance," Caleb commanded. "Say it out loud. Tell your men that Claire's debt is paid in full. Or I swear to God, Victor, I will let my men off their leashes and you won't live to see the sunrise." The tension in the room was absolute. Claire held her breath, watching the silent battle of wills. Victor looked at his men. They were looking at Caleb with abject terror. They knew the rumors. They knew a fight with Thorne's syndicate was a death sentence. Slowly, agonizingly, Victor lowered his gun. He looked at Claire, his eyes burning with hatred, but entirely defeated. He pulled a heavy black marker from his pocket, opened the ledger, and struck a thick black line through Claire's name. "It's done," Victor growled, throwing the book back onto the table. "The debt is cleared. Take her and get out." Caleb didn't move immediately. He looked around the room, making eye contact with every single armed man, ensuring they memorized his face and understood the hierarchy of power. Then he turned to Claire, his rigid posture softening instantly. He offered his arm. "Let's go home," he said. Claire took his arm, her legs feeling like jelly, but she walked out of the VIP lounge with her head held high, leaving the ruins of her nightmare behind her. The drive back to the estate was silent, but the oppressive, terrifying silence of the ride there had been replaced by something entirely different. It was the silence of a collapsing lung finally drawing in a full breath. The adrenaline was rapidly draining from Claire's system, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion. As the town car wound its way up the dark, winding roads toward the hills, Caleb tapped on the privacy glass. The car smoothly pulled over onto a scenic overlook, the city sprawling out below them in a glittering carpet of lights. Caleb opened his door, and stepped out into the cool night air. Claire hesitated for a moment, then followed him. He was leaning against the stone parapet, staring down at the city he ruled. He had taken off his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, exposing the intricate, dark tattoos winding up his forearms. Without the armor of his bespoke suits, he looked less like a mafia boss and more like a weary gladiator. Claire walked up beside him. The wind whipped her hair across her face. She looked down at the city. For years, those lights had represented danger, debt, and fear. Tonight, they just looked beautiful. "You're shaking," Caleb noted quietly, without looking at her. He shrugged off his shoulder holster, tossing it onto the hood of the car, and then took his coat and draped it heavily over her shoulders. The fabric was warm and smelled of cedar and gunpowder. "It's just the adrenaline fading," Claire whispered, pulling the coat tighter around herself. She turned to look at him. His profile was sharp, illuminated by the city glow. "Why did you do this, Caleb? Truly, you didn't know me. I spilled coffee on you. Men like you. You don't burn down rival syndicates for a clumsy waitress." Caleb was quiet for a long time. He watched a plane slowly descending toward the distant airport. "When I was a kid," Caleb began, his voice low and distant, tracing memories he rarely allowed to surface. "My mother owed money to men like Marcus, men like Victor. I was 10 years old. I remember the sound of their boots on the stairs. I remember the way her hands shook when she counted out the crinkled dollar bills she made from sewing." He turned his head, his grey eyes locking onto hers, stripping away the impenetrable facade of the boss. "When you poured that coffee, and I saw your hands. I didn't see you, I saw her, and I saw myself, standing there, too small and too weak to stop the monsters." Claire's breath hitched. She saw the vulnerability beneath the iron exterior, the old, unhealed wound that drove the ruthless man. "I built an empire so I would never have to be afraid again," Caleb continued, stepping closer to her. "I became the biggest monster in the room, so the other monsters would leave me alone. I tell myself it's just business. I tell myself I'm indifferent. But watching that piece of garbage put his hands on you..." Caleb's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening. "Power is completely meaningless, Claire, if you only use it to count money. True power is having the ability to say no when the rest of the world demands suffering." He reached up, his large, rough fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence he had orchestrated hours earlier. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he whispered. "The debt is gone. Victor won't touch you. If anyone ever looks at you or your sister the wrong way, they will have to go through me. And nobody goes through me." Tears welled up in Claire's eyes, hot and fast. The crushing weight that had sat on her chest for 6 months finally, truly shattered. She didn't think about who he was or what he did. She just saw the man who had stepped into the dark and pulled her into the light. Operating on pure emotion, Claire threw her arms around Caleb's neck, burying her face in his chest. Caleb froze for a fraction of a second. Physical affection, genuine, uncalculated warmth, was foreign to him. But then slowly his massive arms wrapped around her, pulling her tight against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, closing his eyes, letting the solid reality of her safety wash over him. In a life built on violence and shadows, this moment, standing on the edge of the city, holding a trembling waitress in his arms, felt like the most real thing he had ever done. 2 weeks later, the Silver Star Diner was busy with the Sunday morning rush. The sun was streaming through the plate glass windows, highlighting the floating dust motes and making the chrome fixtures gleam. The erratic neon sign had been replaced. The peeling linoleum had been repaired. The diner felt lighter, brighter, entirely detached from the grim nightmare it had been just a fortnight ago. Claire was wiping down the counter. She wore a crisp, new uniform. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her skin glowing with a healthy color that hadn't been there for years. The dark bags under her eyes were gone. She moved with a fluid, relaxed energy, chatting with the regulars, pouring coffee with steady, confident hands. The bell above the door chimed. Claire looked up, and a genuine, radiant smile broke across her face. Caleb walked in. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He wore dark jeans and a fitted black Henley shirt, looking entirely out of place among the truckers and local families, yet effortlessly commanding the space. He didn't look like a mob boss. He looked like a man seeking refuge. He walked to the corner booth, his booth. He sat down, sliding into the red vinyl, and waited. Claire didn't rush. She finished wiping down the counter, poured a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, and walked over to him. She didn't tremble. She didn't spill a drop. She set the mug down gently in front of him. "Morning," she said, leaning slightly against the table. "Morning," Caleb replied, his grey eyes looking up at her, softening instantly. He took a sip of the coffee. "Better than last time?" Claire laughed, a bright, clear sound that made Caleb's chest tight. "I practiced. How are things at the office?" "Quiet," Caleb said, leaning back. And it was true. The city had been incredibly peaceful since the Tarasov syndicate had been violently dismantled and absorbed. "Very quiet. How is Lily?" "She loves the new school," Claire said, her eyes shining with gratitude. Caleb had quietly pulled strings to get Lily into a prestigious private academy, paid in full anonymously. "And the apartment you found for us?" "Caleb, it's too much. I don't know how to repay you." Caleb reached out, placing his hand gently over hers where it rested on the table. His thumb brushed her knuckles. "You already have. You let me remember what it feels like to do something decent." They sat in silence for a moment, the bustling noise of the diner fading into the background. It was an unspoken understanding. They existed in entirely different universes, one of light and honest work, one of shadows and ruthless power. But they had forged a bridge between those worlds. He was her protector, a dark guardian angel, and she was his tether to humanity, a reminder that even monsters could save a life. Caleb pulled a $20 bill from his pocket and slid it under the saucer. He stood up, towering over the booth. "I have to go. Meetings." "Will I see you again?" Claire asked, her voice quiet, entirely devoid of fear. Caleb looked down at her, the ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "I like the coffee here, Claire. I'll be around." He turned and walked toward the door. Claire watched him go, the heavy door chiming, as he stepped out into the bright morning sunlight. She picked up the $20 bill. Beneath it, written on a clean white napkin, in sharp, elegant handwriting, was a private phone number and 2 words, "Always here." Claire folded the napkin carefully, sliding it into her apron pocket. The world was still a dark, dangerous place. But as she picked up her tray and walked back to the counter, she knew she would never have to face the dark alone again. True strength isn't measured by the power to destroy, but by the courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Sometimes the most terrifying figures in our lives are the ones who understand fear the most and use their darkness to keep our light from being extinguished. Caleb and Claire found humanity in the unlikeliest of places, a testament that redemption and safety can begin with a single, spilled cup of coffee. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a gripping, emotional redemption story, and subscribe to the channel for more intense, cinematic tales. Let me know in the comments what you thought of Caleb's protective, instincts.